Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. The New York Times wants to build a $119 billion wall. A 6-mile-long barrier would help protect the city from floodwaters during fierce storms like Sandy, but critics say rising seas make the option inadequate. Picture a storm charging towards New York City, pushing a surge of seawater like the one that flooded the region during Hurricane Sandy. But this time man-made islands with retractable gates stretch from the Rockaways in Queens to a strip of land in New Jersey south of Staten Island. The gates swing shut. A 6-mile-long wall blocks the deluge, saving property and lives. The giant barrier is the largest of 5 options the Army Corps of Engineers is studying to protect the New York area as storms become more frequent and destructive on a warming Earth. The New York Times claims that sea level is rising and hurricanes are becoming more frequent and destructive because of global warming. And as a result of this, New York needs to build a $120 billion wall. The New York Times also says that that's enough money to feed the entire world for 4 years. New York's most famous resident, Donald Trump, says that the idea is costly, foolish, and environmentally unfriendly. Let's take a look now at the evidence and see which view is correct. There's been a tide gauge at Lower Manhattan since the 1850s. The tide gauge shows that sea level has been rising at the same slow, steady rate since before Abraham Lincoln was president. If there had been an acceleration in sea level rise rates, it would be seen as an upwards curvature in this graph, but that curvature does not exist. There's no indication that humans have had any impact on sea level rise rates. Tide gauges on the west coast of the United States show little or no sea level rise. Some even show sea level falling. So why does the tide gauge at Lower Manhattan show sea level rising? Well, the answer is very simple. The land is sinking. Since the end of the last ice age and the glaciers melting, the eastern half of Canada has been rapidly rising. And just like a teeter-totter, in order to compensate for this, the east coast of the United States has been sinking. The term used by geologists for this is isostasy. In 1988, the world's leading climate expert from NASA predicted that Lower Manhattan would be underwater in 30 years. That would have been 2 years ago. If you remember, James Hansen was the NASA scientist who started the global warming scare before Congress in June of 1988. He said in 1988 that within 20 or 30 years, the West Side Highway, which runs along the Hudson River, would be underwater, and there will be signs in the restaurants saying water by request only. This is a photograph from a New York City traffic camera taken along the West Side Highway this morning. It doesn't actually appear to be underwater right now. It looks like the world's leading climate expert might have gotten his prediction a little bit wrong. Now let's look at the New York Times claims about increasing hurricanes. This graph was made from data from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The blue line is the 20-year mean of the number of landfalling U.S. hurricanes. As you can see, the number of landfalling U.S. hurricanes has dropped sharply over the last 150 years. Hurricanes peaked in the United States when Grover Cleveland was president during the 1880s. There were 26 landfalling hurricanes while he was president. So it's pretty clear that the New York Times claims of increasing hurricanes is also not true. This is the same graph except for major hurricanes, those with winds over 120 miles per hour. Major hurricanes peaked in the United States during the 1940s and 1950s and have recently been at a record low. 4 years ago, the Washington Post was terrified by the lack of major hurricanes hitting the United States. They said that the lack of major hurricanes was unprecedented. So once again, the New York Times article was the exact opposite of reality. Now let's take a look at hurricanes which made landfall in New York. New York has been hit by 14 hurricanes since the 1850s. The red bars on this graph show major hurricanes. New York has only been hit by 2 hurricanes since carbon dioxide went over 350 parts per million in 1988. And the last major hurricane to hit New York was Hurricane Gloria in 1985, when carbon dioxide was below 350 parts per million. Hurricane Sandy did a lot of damage, but it wasn't a major hurricane. In fact, it wasn't even a hurricane at all when it made landfall. The big problem with Hurricane Sandy was that it came in at the same time as the highest tide of the month. Around this time last year, New York's Governor Cuomo said that New York didn't used to have hurricanes. We did not have hurricanes in the state of New York, Cuomo said. We did not have superstorms in the state of New York. Ronald Reagan famously said, "The trouble with our liberal friends isn't so much that they're ignorant, it's just that they know so much that isn't so." New York's worst hurricane actually occurred in 1821. It It was a Category 4 hurricane with wind gusts over 156 miles per hour, but fortunately it came in at low tide. Had the 1821 storm come in at high tide like Sandy, it would have wiped out most of Manhattan. This report from insurance company Swiss Re said, if the 1821 hurricane were to happen today, it would cause 50% more damage than Sandy and potentially cause more than $100 billion in property losses stemming from storm surge and wind damage. So if there was a repeat of the 1821 hurricane, the $120 billion seawall would almost pay for itself. This is a news story from 1821 about the hurricane. The article said that the hurricane, in about 2 hours on Monday evening, did more damage in the city and vicinity than was ever before witnessed. During the prevalence of this gale, all human exertions to afford relief to vessels in distress were unavailing. It would be useless to attempt to designate each house which has received more or less damage by having chimneys blown down, roofs wholly and partially stripped off. The roofs and cornices of Mr. Schimmerhorn's block of stores, extending from Front to South Street on the west side of Fulton Street, were much injured, and every chimney but one carried away. The greatest part of the elegant poplars and weeping willows at Hudson Park were blown down. The 1821 storm came just 6 years after the Great Storm of 1815. This is what Providence, Rhode Island looked like during the 1815 storm. Carbon dioxide levels at the time were about 280 parts per million. Of the 10 deadliest U.S. hurricanes, all but 2 occurred more than 90 years ago. 2 of them occurred in the year 1893. And 9 of the 25 deadliest Atlantic hurricanes occurred right around the time of the American Revolutionary War, including the deadliest in 1780. The 1780 hurricane killed more than 20,000 people, and was reported that the storm was so violent that not a single house, church, building, or public edifice was left standing in Barbados. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reports that there were more than 24,000 deaths in the 1780 hurricane and that winds were over 200 miles per hour. They say that the bark was stripped right off the trees. So what do the New York Times, NASA's James Hansen, and Governor Cuomo have in common? None of them have any clue what they're talking about. But one person who does understand hurricanes is Barack Obama. Hurricane Sandy came in the week before the 2012 election and likely got him reelected. His motto was, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." After Hurricane Sandy, the White House issued a report blaming it on climate change. But Barack Obama doesn't really seem to be that worried about sea level rise or hurricanes because he just bought a $15 million mansion on the beach at Martha's Vineyard. This is what the New England coast looked like after the 1938 hurricane. My mother was living in Brooklyn at the time, and she remembered looking out the windows and seeing the trees bent over all the way to the ground. This map shows all the tropical cyclones around the United States over the last 151 years. There have been thousands of them, but the New York Times believes that the last few were caused by a 1 part per 10,000 increase in carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere over the past century. The New York Times believes that they can prevent hurricanes by implementing the New Green Deal. New York got a sneak preview of the New Green Deal after Hurricane Sandy when the electricity was out for several days. The carbon footprint of New York and New Jersey went way down when people had to line up for hours to obtain fossil fuels. It isn't completely clear why the New York Times would advocate this sort of lifestyle for their residents. Today marks the 1-year anniversary of the author of the New Green Deal, Alexandria Cortez, announcing that the world is going to end in 12 years. This means that there's only 11 years left for the world, so I'm not sure it's a wise investment to spend $120 billion on a seawall which will probably never be used. It might be a better investment to spend that $120 billion feeding the world's children for 4 years. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.